So welcome. This is our first attorney lecture series of 2024, and I am happy to introduce to you Eduardo Franco, who is a U.S. Air Force veteran and a former juvenile probation officer and a former federal officer in the Western District of Texas. He's been practicing law and been an attorney since 2006, and his practice mostly focuses on criminal defense and immigration law. He also represents citizens and non-US citizens accused of crimes, and he has an emphasis on immigration consequences for those non-US citizens. And his law practice handles immigration, family petitions, and citizenship process. So without further ado, let me introduce to you Eduardo Franco.
All righty. Okay, thank you, Andrew. Glad to be up here, glad to be of any service, assistance that we can provide. So we'll do this question and answer form.
Yeah, you want me to give him a...
Okay.
So kind of the first question I wanted to ask is, why did you choose immigration and how did you kind of get into that area of law?
Okay. I chose immigration through law school. As I was in second year of law school, I started taking some immigration courses, was fascinated with it, and it kind of took off from there. But even before I went into law school, in fact, the reason I went into law school was as a federal probation officer. I was in federal court often. I wrote PSIs the last couple of years that I was with the feds, pre-sentence investigations. So I had to testify quite often. And I noticed a lot of the defendants were not US citizens. And of course, a lot of them didn't speak English. They spoke Spanish or other languages. And I kind of felt that some of the legal representation was not adequate. So that steered me in the direction of immigration, but it started in law school.
And what have you learned kind of over the years compared to what you kind of knew in the beginning?
Well, immigration is complex. There's no doubt. But immigration covers a wide spectrum. In other words, you have family immigration, you have business immigration. Most of the major corporations in America utilize immigration visas, and that's the immigration visa portion of it. It's a whole section in and of itself. We focus mostly on criminal law and immigration, so that is where deportations come in, because a lot of deportations are based on criminal convictions. So it's a wide spectrum, but we narrowed it down to criminal and immigration, and as you said earlier, mostly the immigration consequences.
So what changes have you kind of seen in immigration law over the years?
Well, there have been quite a few changes, but most of the changes involve, believe it or not, allowing various people to come into the country for different reasons. Sometimes it has to do with political strife in that other country, and sometimes it has to do with natural disasters in the other country. And so those are temporary visas. In fact, a lot of it is called TPS, temporary protective status, and they're allowed to come in much easier than someone who's just trying to apply through a family member or so forth. So those changes occur whenever the political winds change, or the natural disasters. In terms of the changes of criminal activity, in terms of labeling those crimes as, for example, as aggravated felonies, we haven't seen too many changes in that. Although I will tell you that something that seems minor or innocuous for a criminal defense attorney, for example, a possession of marijuana, Class B misdemeanor, that's kind of on the low end of the totem pole. But for immigration, it could be disastrous, and it could really affect that person's life.
Are there any current kind of new laws that have kind of gone into effect in Texas that are affecting your practice and how you do things?
Well, sure. I mean, in terms of immigration, I'll mention DACA, which it's not very new now because it started in the Obama administration, but DACA allowed, probably millions of people who were here undocumented to all of a sudden have documentation. It didn't give them immigration status per se. DACA is not immigration status. They cannot travel outside the United States and come back with it. But they can obtain employment. They can obtain a Social Security card. And so they're documented. And of course, Texas is one of the biggest states that has DACA recipients. So that's impacted our practice because anyone who has DACA has to be very careful if they're ever accused of a crime. And again, it might seem like a minor crime. They may talk to a criminal defense attorney, even an experienced one, and that attorney might downplay it. He might say, "Well, it's a DWI first, and we can keep it sort of innocuous." But I guarantee you, a DWI first for a DACA recipient is deadly because he or she will lose DACA and then placed in removal proceedings, which is deportation proceedings. So those kind of changes have occurred, and case law changes occasionally with an immigration law. For example, crimes of moral turpitude. That's a big negative for any person who's standing in front of an immigration judge asking for benefits or relief. And crimes of moral turpitude in the world of criminal defense law and criminal court, they could be something again that doesn't seem that serious. For example, a theft, a misdemeanor theft, Class B misdemeanor from Walmart or wherever, even less, even a Class C misdemeanor theft becomes a crime of moral turpitude for a non-citizen, and it can become deadly, for that person. So what I'm saying is, in the world of criminal law and immigration law, they combine. I mean, 100%. I tell people this all the time. They absolutely combine. Okay, and a diligent criminal defense lawyer, and there are plenty in Fort Bend County. I'm looking at one in front of me, and they have to be aware that even a small misdemeanor theft could have disastrous results, and so they need to either be astute themselves in the immigration laws or bring somebody else in that could assist in that. Yeah.
And how would it, is there a way to bring in somebody to help you assist you with that sort of thing? Like, for instance, obviously not every criminal defense attorney in Fort Bend is going to have an immigration background. So what are your kind of suggestions for an attorney who needs that?
Right. Well, in 2010, the United States Supreme Court came down with a huge case called Padilla versus Kentucky. And that case focused exclusively on non-citizens. In other words, a non-citizen accused of a crime. So the essence of Padilla versus Kentucky is that a criminal defense lawyer who represents a non-citizen from that point, from 2010 till now, must advise the defendant of the immigration consequences. Okay. Before 2010, that wasn't the case, at least not to the extent that it is now. So in my opinion, a lot of attorneys they could kind of brush it off and say, well, you can talk to an immigration lawyer after the fact, but that's no longer the case. Now, Padilla has established very strong Sixth Amendment case law that says that defendant needs to know his or her immigration consequences. If the lawyer doesn't practice immigration, as you just said, that's very true, then they have to bring somebody else in or ask for that. And sometimes it happens through motions to the judges, to the court. Sometimes the defendant will retain an immigration attorney, such as myself. So there are different ways to go about it, but it has to be done because they fall into a completely different category. Yeah.
So what would you say to somebody that, they do criminal defense and they want to add something like immigration to part of their practice, what kind of COEs do they need to, like,
Yeah.
certification? What goes into that?
I mean, I believe that to understand immigration law, you have to understand the global scope of immigration. So the only way to learn that is to learn Immigration 101, which is what I did in law school. And it's a lengthy process because, to be honest, I was ignorant to all of that. I knew very little about the visas. I always tell judges, the United States gives out over 80 kinds of visas in the United States. And so how do we know, how does the court know what this person's visa, if they have a visa? They don't have to, because it's not an immigration court, it's a criminal court. But to learn immigration, in my opinion, the practitioner has to get the global perspective. Again, they could come in with an F1 student visa, for example. They could come in with an H-1B and work for Schlumberger as an engineer, or a PhD working for Memorial Hermann. I mean, it's just, it runs the gamut. And unless you understand these visas and at least have a global perspective of it, then you're not going to understand the consequences. So that's what I would advise to, you got to learn it from the global perspective.
So for self-represented litigants or individuals that are seeking an attorney, maybe they got charged with a crime, maybe they're non-citizens, what would you tell them, and especially if they want to hire an immigration attorney, what are things that they need to know before they do that?
Well, I would tell them to ask a lot of questions. I think it'll become evident pretty quickly when they start telling the attorney their main concerns. For example, Rick and I, we've had people in front of us and we ask them, what do you want to see happen here? And most non-citizens will say, well, I want to stay in the United States. And the criminal defense lawyer may not even realize that this person is not a U.S. citizen because they may speak perfect English. But all of a sudden, the defense lawyer is saying, you want to stay in the United States? What do you mean? Well, I'm not a U.S. citizen. So now it becomes complicated. Now immigration law is in the mix. So I would say to that person, pro se litigant or whomever, ask a lot of questions, but put it out there. Stay with my family. Yeah.
Yeah, can I pose a question?
Of course. Right.
If we've got a DACA and they're charged with a crime, your example, DWI, okay, first offense, must be misdemeanor. My understanding is if they accept deferred probation, they plead to it, whatever, as far as immigration is concerned, that's a black mark against them. Okay.
Right.
If they go ahead and under our current DA take a position where they're basically not charged and it's a diversion.
Like a pretrial diversion. Yes.
Yeah,
Yes,
pretrial diversion.
Mhm.
Does that protect them?
Okay, well, so Rick Forlano is sitting here with me, and it's a very good question. Pretrial diversion, how does it impact, especially a DACA recipient?
Yeah.
And you have to look at the pretrial diversion parameters themselves, because Fort Bend County's pretrial diversion might not be the same as Harris County's pretrial diversion or any other county. So the key is, and there's a big case in immigration law called Muhammad. That's actually the name. It's under the BIA, the Board of Immigration Appeals. And that case is very clear. And so is the law on immigration law, that if there is a judicial finding, okay, in other words, if they have to go in front of a judge and swear to it and it becomes kind of a judicial finding, then I believe immigration is going to use it against them. But if there's not a judicial finding, it's just a contract or agreement between the DA's office and your client, then I would say that's a safe bet. That's a safe bet for immigration, because you can take that and explain to an immigration judge, there's no judicial finding here. So there's no way that they can count it as a conviction.
And that's what our DA's office does. We have a contract that we sign with the DA's office without ever having to go in front of a judge and
That's right.
be placed under oath and swear.
That's correct. Right. I know other counties are not like that.
Sure.
So the defense attorney has to make that an issue, because you mentioned DWI first for DACA. Well, if you look at DACA and you look at the parameters of DACA, a DWI is a killer. It's one of the enumerated offenses that will strip DACA away from that person. And then in theory, they'll be placed in removal proceedings. Okay. I mean, it's still a process, but it's enumerated. So just like an assaultive, like a family violence. So those are very serious accusations. They're very serious crimes for DACA recipients. Yeah. It's a good question.
One other question I had, just in regards to Fort Bend County, is there any, kind of specific things that an attorney dealing with Fort Bend County in particular, either with, criminal offense and immigration law, how they intersect in Fort Bend would compare to, say, dealing with it in Harris County?
I practice in Harris County and Fort Bend and other counties surrounding the area. And I think for the most part, the practitioners, prosecutors, they understand the immigration issues when it's brought to their attention, because they have to deal with it quite often. But again, whose responsibility is this? It's not the prosecutors. It's not the judges. It's the defense lawyer. Okay. And so that's why I say the diligent attorneys like Mr. Forlano, they're going to take the extra step. That's my biggest advice. But we've known this since 2010, actually before 2010. Padilla versus Kentucky goes back a long way. I use that case quite often. And I can tell you that it cites all the way back to 1995. So, Justice Sotomayor, her dissent is beautiful. And it goes way back. But essentially it says, heck, if you're going to represent somebody who's not a U.S. citizen, that's a different path. And so, but I think Harris County, Fort Bend, they take it seriously. When the defense attorney brings it up and shows them that we have some concerns here because there's a DACA recipient or whatever, they'll take it seriously for the most part. They don't have to, but at least you're protecting your client's interests. And then you can make a record of it and show that, we brought it to their attention. Yeah.
So how many attorneys are there kind of in Fort Bend area that kind of do what you do and you're specialized in immigration? Does a lot of these type of cases happen around here?
Okay, a lot of these kind of cases do happen around here. I will say that I'm not a specialist in these two in terms of board specialization. I'm not board certified in either one at this point. But that's our focus. We deal with immigration law and criminal law on a daily basis. We're constantly, as Mr. Fulano knows, we're in criminal courts every day, and we're in immigration courts as well. So that's our focus. I can't stand here and say that we specialize in that because it's not board certified. However, as a daily part of your routine, I mean, you have to keep up with this, with the law. You have to understand how it's going to impact your client. So again, in Fort Bend County, one of the most diverse counties in the country, you have a huge immigrant population. And you have a lot of people in Fort Bend that it'd be easy for the defense attorney to assume that they're a U.S. citizen because they're educated, they speak perfect English. But again, the defense attorney has to inquire and not assume. Yeah.
And I would imagine through indigent defense, that might be one of the first questions you would probably ask your client?
I think it's number 3 in our intake sheet.
Yeah.
Where were you born? You know,
Right.
and then we go from there. Yes, we have our intake process from our law office focuses on the history of the person, because you have to know. You have to know what their concerns are. And sometimes they won't even tell you, but they'll write it down. So you have to bring it up.
Well, that's good to know. You know, I that doesn't surprise me that somebody wouldn't tell you, but they'd still write it down, you know, that sort of thing. So,
Right.
Is there any other, like tips you would have for defense attorneys to know in regards to immigration status and things like that?
Well, you asked earlier, the second part of your question, how many attorneys do this kind of combination? There aren't that many, really. Even in Fort Bend, as Rick knows, I would say less than 5 in Fort Bend. And I know some very good practitioners that do what I do, San Antonio area, Austin area. But even those cities, those big cities, a handful. So we're very limited. But we're a very tight group because, as I told you earlier, the American Immigration Lawyers Association, it's a huge association, just like Texas Criminal Defense Bar. And we learn from each other. And I'm kind of surprised. I think it's going to grow. It's going to probably, the students that are coming out of law school are starting to emphasize this, the ones that want to do criminal law. So I see it growing, but it's still a small number. Yeah.
No, I will tell you, I help out with the public defender's office during magistrations on weekends. And I can't tell you the number of defendants who we process on a weekend who are not U.S. citizens. Who, one of the things we offer to them is, do you want us to contact your consulate?
Right.
And let them know that you've been arrested.
Right.
Okay. And, most of them say no.
Correct.
And not all of them are, non-English speakers. Some of them are English speakers. And, we're just doing the magistrations. When they go out and get an attorney appointed and whatnot, I often wonder, okay, what's that defense attorney's going to do with this person? Because this person is here, this person is now accused of a crime, but they're not a citizen.
Yeah, it's a very different scenario than representing a citizen.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That's why I say, there's a fork in the road, and the lawyer has to figure out, he can't continue the same path that he continues on every other. He's got to take the other road. And if it means bringing somebody else in, then that's his obligation. Or asking the court. There are ways of doing it through motions. Yeah.
I would think as a defense attorney, especially if you're an American citizen and you're trying to ask for your clients, I would hope the client doesn't take it as, you're asking them their immigration status and take it as like racial profiling. I mean,
No.
How did that's not a consideration?
I think one of the best cases we ever did, part of our practice is also doing writs of habeas corpus. Sometimes we have to try to set aside a plea agreement that was taken a few years prior. And one of the best cases I think we did was a young man from Norway, 6 foot tall, blonde hair, blue eyed, spoke perfect English.
Sure.
And he got arrested in Fayette County for a little bit of marijuana, Class B misdemeanor. And on his first setting in court, his attorney took a plea deal, and it was a deferred adjudication. It was for 6 months. Sounded like no big deal. The case was going to be dismissed. That's true under state law, but not under federal, not under immigration law. They're very different. So he travels to see his grandparents in Norway. He comes back to Houston. As he's going through the airport, they pull him up and they said, turn around. They handcuffed him, and he got arrested at the airport. And that's when the family got a hold of us and we got involved. Long story short, we were able to set aside that plea agreement from Fayette County because the lawyer did not inquire, and there was no record of it. And we had a very good case, and it worked out well for the young man. In fact, about a month ago, I went with him to get his citizenship. The marijuana issue was probably 6, 7 years prior, but we got his citizenship. I went with him about a month ago. So, you know, those kinds of things, there's no racial profiling, because it could be a blonde hair, blue eyed kid, or it could be, you know, a dark skinned Guatemalan that does landscaping. And of course he's going to be dark, or roofing, you know. I don't see any racial profiling from our perspective. Do you see that, Rick?
No.
I don't think so.
No, we're just trying to help.
That's it. Yeah.
I just didn't know if there was any misunderstanding in regards to that from the client's perspective.
No, the clients are grateful, because I've had too many clients come in and say, hey, you know, I took this plea 5 years ago and the lawyer never talked about immigration. So, and they're very upset. So no, they're grateful.
So my final question that I have, as far as like where to find resources on this topic. So like one, obviously the immigration law source book through ILA. For instance, we have that on the shelf.
That's right. Yeah.
Is there any other kind of resources? Because obviously you need, if you're going to have a dual practice like this, you need to be versed not only in state law, but in federal law,
Right.
as you mentioned. So is there any other kind of resources that would be helpful for an attorney to look at, you know, in addition to like the immigration law source book?
Right. I think Fort Bend County has a very good resource catalog of immigration here in this library, for being as small as it is, you know, and I've gone to Harris counties as well. Fort Bend competes with Harris County easily, because you've brought in some really good sources, Curse ban, for example, some other immigration statutes. But I mean, if a person wants to practice this, there are a lot of guides and some authors that are focusing exclusively on this area, and they actually call it crimmigration now. It's labeled, and in fact, at Rusty Duncan, we always touch on that. Rusty Duncan is a CLE, a very large criminal defense bar CLE, and it's probably one of the best I've ever been to. So that's what I would say, is that if a practitioner wants to learn about it, it's going to take some time, but that's what you have to do, you know. And it's a learning process. It's always a learning process.
Any other questions? Rick, do you have any other questions?
No, I think Eduardo was done a really good job explaining what's going on, and he's correct. The big thing, and I think we need to emphasize it to our defense bar people, is, you know, when you get these folks, one of the first things you really want to ask them is, what's your citizenship status? You know?
Yeah.
Because again, as Eduardo said, going in front of a judge and raising your hand and swearing to something can get you into trouble real quick with feds.
Is there anything else you want to talk about in relation to any of that, that for anybody that would want to know?
No, I think Rick makes a good point. You know, when we have clients standing up there and raising their right hand in front of the judge, oftentimes that's their first time they're doing that, and they're scared and they're nervous, and they may say something like, when the question is asked, are you a U.S. citizen? They may say yes, not realizing exactly what the question means. Well, who's responsible for correcting them, you know, or bringing that up? It's the lawyer. It's the defense lawyer. So the defense lawyer really needs to pay attention to that. And again, it starts at intake. You know, it starts in the very beginning. It can't be, immigration issues cannot be dealt with after the fact. They have to be part of the very inception. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. Let's see if our virtual person has any
Okay.
questions.
All right, you're welcome.
Thank you. Is there any other questions? Do we have any questions on the chat here? She just says, excellent presentation. Thank you. Okay. If you're watching this in a recording and you have any questions, feel free to send them to me. I'll add my email to the posting, and then I will forward it on to Mr. Franco, and maybe we can get you some answers. So thank you very much for coming, and have a good day.